Van Gogh was admitted to a mental hospital, Saint-Paul in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, on May 3, 1889, after a conflict with Paul Gauguin in Arles. Arles is a small village in the far south of France where Vincent came to get away from the city and create a new southern movement. The Studio of the South, a kind of brotherhood of artists and like-minded people working for future generations. He gave Paul Gauguin a central role in this movement. Gauguin enthusiastically embraced the idea, creating his own movement, and also supported the artist's initiative financially. Vincent's younger brother, Theo, supported him throughout his life in all his whims and undertakings. Gauguin arrives in Arles, where he and Van Gogh rent a studio together in the so-called Yellow House, which we see in the artist's painting. They are driven by the idea of changing art and no less bringing it to a new renaissance. However, they do not forget about the physical side of things, so they often party and look for new models, including in brothels. Van Gogh writes to his friend, "Now this will interest you. We visited brothels several times, and it's quite likely that soon we'll be going there often to work." Right now, Gauguin is working on a painting of the same night cafe that I also painted, but he has models that we saw in the brothel. It will clearly be a beautiful piece. Alcohol had a strong effect on Van Gogh's already unstable psyche. The artist always had trouble socializing. People around him considered him a slob and a layabout, which was only made worse by his fondness for absinthe. And, to put it in modern terms, Van Gogh apparently suffered from alcoholism, spending his free time at the local cafe in the company of young drinking companions. Jeanne Calment, who lived in Arles all her life, said that she met Van Gogh in her father's shop when she was 13 years old. The artist seemed dirty, poorly dressed, and unfriendly to her. In another interview, she said that she refused to serve him because he was as ugly as sin, had a nasty temper, and smelled of alcohol. Van Gogh often got drunk, and his binges were sometimes accompanied by fits of anger. During one of those binges, apparently it was during one of those times that Van Gogh and Gauguin had the very altercation where Van Gogh attacked Gauguin with a razor in his hand. The reasons are unclear, but one theory suggests Van Gogh attacked Gauguin in his sleep and Gauguin narrowly escaped. As a result, Van Gogh, according to the common version, consumed by remorse, or according to experts, under the influence of absinthe-induced madness, cut off his own ear. He wrapped it in paper and brought it to the door of the brothel where he and Gauguin had often visited. He handed the bloody package to the brothel maid Gabrielle Berlatier, saying, "Take this, it might be useful to you," and left. It was always believed that he only cut off his earlobe, but recent research results indicate that the situation was much more serious. This conclusion was made possible by a letter discovered quite recently, in 2016, from Felix Rey, the doctor at the psychiatric hospital in Arles, who treated Van Gogh. The letters are accompanied by sketches showing the nature of the artist's injury and leave no doubt that he cut off his entire ear. This significantly alters the gravity of the artist's state. It's one thing to scratch your earlobe, but it's something else entirely to lose your whole ear. Unfortunately, this tells us about an extreme degree of mental instability, which led to a series of episodes that resulted in him ending up in a hospital. This incident outraged the residents of the small town of Arles so much that they demanded the artist be isolated. Van Gogh was admitted to a psychiatric hospital the next day, on February 24, 1888. On his first day at the clinic, he had a severe attack, leading doctors to diagnose him with temporal lobe epilepsy and place him in a ward for violent patients. After reporting what had happened, Theo Gauguin hurriedly left Arles, leaving Van Gogh in the hospital. The friendship between the two great artists, as well as their bold plans, came to an end. Van Gogh spent 3 months in a terrible psychiatric hospital, which was more like a prison. All psychiatric clinics of that time were more like dungeons from horror movies. He begged to be allowed to go out and paint, but the townspeople wrote a letter to the mayor to prevent this. They didn't want to tolerate a violently insane person in the city who attacked people with a razor. And on May 3rd, Theo managed to arrange for his brother to be transferred to another, more progressive mental hospital. Saint-Paul de Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, not far from Arles, where he would go on to paint Starry Night. The new clinic was nothing like the previous one. It was more like a boarding house, expensive and quite comfortable, with its own garden, attic, and beautiful views. Its owner believed in the healing power of art and the beauty that surrounds a person. At Theo's insistence, a studio was set up for Van Gogh where he could paint, and Van Gogh did not miss this opportunity, painting every day during his periods of clarity. While in the asylum for a year, Van Gogh produced over 150 paintings and around 100 drawings and watercolors. And it is here in captivity, tormented by feelings of guilt and loneliness, that Van Gogh finds his final style, which will elevate him to the level of a genius. He painted very quickly, almost a painting a day, and on the very first day he created his famous irises, which he saw in the asylum's garden. He could walk and look at the landscapes, but at night, through the barred window of his room, he could see only the sky. He writes to Theo, "I also want to paint a starry night over the cypresses or maybe over ripe wheat fields." There are very beautiful nights here. There is a theory that Van Gogh painted Starry Night while observing it from the window of his room, but that's impossible. His studio was separate and it didn't have any windows at all, so he had to paint from sketches and memory. At night, he was in his room, and the only thing he saw was the night sky, and during the day he painted in the windowless studio what he had absorbed during the night. Perhaps this explains why this painting depicts an impossible landscape that simply couldn't be seen from his window. The village couldn't be seen from the window, but it could be seen from the garden. Researchers also found that the moon was not in that phase at the time, but Venus was actually very close to Earth and dominated the sky. The diagonal of the horizon was depicted realistically, but the cypress was brought closer to create a harmonious connection between the sky and the Earth. Van Gogh in this painting uses his almost signature contrast of blue and yellow. At the same time, he uses a unique technique. He doesn't mix paints on the palette like everyone else, but squeezes them directly onto the canvas and spreads them with small, thick strokes, creating a unique texture where the light spots dominate over the rest of the painting's surface. That's exactly how the stars were painted. He squeezed out the paint, then spread it around, and this created the glowing effect, the very effect that amazes us when we look at this painting. Of course, Van Gogh couldn't actually see the swirl in the sky either. That's why the Starry Night is a mix of real pieces of landscapes recreated from sketches in the studio and the artist's imagination. A kind of collage of truth and fiction. Amazingly, the turbulence that Van Gogh depicted in the painting matches the cosmic flows in places where stars are born. But back then, space wasn't even a suspicion. But I think that it's not really a premonition of space, it's just the artist could see swirls and colors in the water when he rinsed his brushes, and that suggested a direction of thought to him. And right at that time, Van Gogh was going through a kind of breakdown. He always preferred to paint from life and resisted with all his might when he had to paint something imagined. Before that, he argued a lot with Gauguin about whether a real work of art could be the result of imagination. He was sure that an artist could interpret reality, but not invent it, because that would reduce art to abstraction. That's exactly how Gauguin referred to paintings that existed only in the imagination. At that time, no one was even thinking about abstractionism. It would only appear 30 years later. In his letter to Bernard, Van Gogh writes, "While Gauguin was living in Arles, I let myself be drawn into abstraction a couple of times, but that was a mistake. Dear friend, I was heading for a dead end, and once again I lost my way there, trying to paint large stars. Alas, it was another failure, and this time I've had enough." But it's the impossible, fantastical details of the Starry Night that actually make it special. Huge, bright stars covering the sky, the two-faced mistress moon, swirls of air and light giving the night sky movement, the cypress, whose branches look more like dark flames reaching upward. That's what gives the painting a sense of frozen beauty, of the eternal motion of the universe coming to a halt, so immense that the small, unremarkable village below seems lucky just to have witnessed such beauty. You may have heard that Van Gogh never studied to be an artist, that he was self-taught, but that's not entirely true. He studied quite a lot with different teachers, but mostly in fits and starts, constantly dropping out and believing that diligence and hard work were more important than talent, which he didn't see in himself. He wrote, "As an artist, I will never become anything significant. I am absolutely certain of that. This could only be the case if everything about me changed, my character, upbringing, and life circumstances." He was rather an underachiever. His entire creative journey lasted only 10 years, and he started painting at a rather mature age for an artist when he was already 27. and he only found his own distinctive and recognizable style a couple of years before his death, managing to create just about 200 paintings during that period, which are now considered the most valuable part of his legacy. And, I think that's exactly what defined the originality and uniqueness of the style that Van Gogh was ultimately able to achieve. His ideas about painting were not irreversibly poisoned by the demands of classicism and the Academy of Arts. He painted the way he saw things, having learned the basics of drawing technique, but not of style. At the same time, the mature age at which he began to paint left a mark of experience, often bitter, and colored his work with the wisdom of a man who had been through a lot. Now, there is even a very popular idea that modern artists have taken from Van Gogh. Young artists deliberately choose not to study, not to learn history or art, in order to avoid the influence of great masters and to develop their own unique style. And Van Gogh, deprived of the opportunity to paint from life and forced to draw from memory, although he really didn't like it, unknowingly created something that proved that an artist's imagination is a force capable of creating its own beauty, sometimes much, much more impressive than reality. But Van Gogh himself didn't like the painting. He considered it a failure and was embarrassed by it, just like we sometimes feel embarrassed now when someone catches us photoshopping our pictures. When 3 months later it was time to send Theo some paintings for sale and there was only enough money to send a few, Vincent rejected Starry Night. He wrote to Theo, "Overall, the only ones I consider somewhat valuable are the wheat field, the mountain, the orchard, and the olive trees with blue hills. The portrait and the entrance to the mine. The rest doesn't mean anything to me." And Starry Night was among the rest. Van Gogh himself called the painting Night Study. He sent it to Theo in the second batch in late September. The painting, almost unknown, changed hands many times until 1941 when it was acquired by New York's MoMA, and only then did it begin to gain the true recognition it deserved. There are several interpretations of the painting, but it seems to me that this is exactly the case when no far-fetched interpretations are needed. Some claim that the 11 stars are a reference to the Bible, while others say that the cypress is Van Gogh himself. There are even those who say that the cypress is the Eiffel Tower, which was built in Paris that very year. But I doubt that Van Gogh could have seen it from 1,000 kilometers away. But there's one interpretation I'd like to share with you. Van Gogh wrote to Theo, "Looking at the stars, I always start to dream. I ask myself, why should the bright spots in the sky be less accessible to us than the black spots on the map of France? And just as a train takes us to Tarascon or Rouen, so death will take us to one of the stars." And Van Gogh, being in turmoil and reflecting on death, perhaps depicted his future ascent in the blazing curves of the cypress, from the peaceful everyday life below to the divine splendor of the heavens. And if you like beautiful interpretations, I offer you this one. It seems to me that it most harmoniously reflects what Van Gogh himself might have put into his painting. I hope I inspired at least a bit of love for this painting in you. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. Here, we talk about art in an interesting and most importantly, honest way. This was Nina Shiev with you. Goodbye, everyone.